Hello, my name is Preston Gunter, and today I'm going to be talking about the failures of the war on drugs. In 1979, Richard Nixon said, America's public enemy number one was drug abuse. He said, in order to fight this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. This new outlook on substances started the war on drugs. This was not a war fought with science or research, but it was more of a war that was fought with fear and prison time, using government resources to attack people. I want you to leave this speech with a new perspective on how drug laws are made and how they can be used to target groups of people who the government doesn't like. Ask yourself the following questions. Does making drugs illegal actually protect neighborhoods? Is it wrong that there is mandatory sentencing for drugs? How could drugs be used to target certain groups of people in neighborhoods? These are questions that have always sparked my interest. Today I'm going to be giving you some information that I have found on this topic. Hopefully you can leave this discussion with a new perspective of drug control. I would first like to speak about how the war on drugs started on a lie and how they used this lie to make propaganda and to attack groups of people. One of Richard Nixon's top advisors, John Elcherman, and a key figure in the Watergate scandal, said this about the war on drugs. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I am saying? We knew we could not make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. He later added, "Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Here are some interesting facts about the war on drugs. Despite the drugs war efforts to cut supplies, worldwide illicit opium production rose tenfold from 12,000 tons in 1971 to a record 10,300 tons in 2017. Reflecting its emphasis on punishment over treatment, the number of people jailed for drug offenses would also grow tenfold from 40,900 in 1980 to 430,900 in 2019. Finally, instead of reducing domestic use, the drug war actually helped stimulate a tenfold surge in the number of American heroin users from just 68,000 in 1970 to 745,000 in 2019. Let's now talk about the Reagan administration and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. 1981, only about 2% of the electorate felt that drug abuse was the nation's number one problem. By 1989, an overwhelming 64% of Americans had come to feel that drugs were the nation's number one problem. What caused such a shift? In 1986, Reagan signs the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This act would lead to a quantum expansion of the domestic drug war, including a mandatory minimum sentences of 5 years just for 5 grams of cocaine, and it revived a federal death penalty for traffickers. This act proved to have a huge racial bias and imprisonment that saw a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and the use of powdered cocaine. To enforce such tough penalties, the law also expanded the federal anti-drug budget to a massive $6.5 billion. Now you may be asking yourself, what is the difference between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine, and why should I care about this disparity? Crack cocaine is a drastically cheaper alternative to the very expensive drug known as powdered cocaine. Even though they are the same drug medically, you still have this huge sentencing disparity of 100-to-1, meaning that about 5 grams of crack cocaine will get you a minimum sentence of at least 5 years, while on the other hand, you would need 500 grams of powdered cocaine to get the exact same sentence. Since crack is so much cheaper than its powdered counterpart, it attracts the use of people who are in a lower socioeconomic status. But everyone under these laws did not get treated the same. Even though crack use is similar across all the different races, people of color are the ones who get the most prison time. The war on drugs focused on small-time drug dealers who were generally poor young black males from the inner city. Ultimately, the prison population doubled due to the arrest of drug dealers and their customers. Thanks largely to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, Americans jailed for nonviolent drug offenses soared from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. Driven by drug arrests, in 1995, nearly one-third of all African American males between 20 and 29 would either be in prison or on parole. But the unfairness of these laws don't stop there. The average prison terms for crack was 115 months, while the average prison terms for powdered cocaine was 87 months as of 2009. Let's now talk about Bill Clinton and how he gave support to the Violent Crime Control Act of 1994. This act alone would prove to be the largest law enforcement initiative in American history. Nearly $19 billion for 100,000 new cops and a massive prison expansion program to house all of the people who would now be sentenced to a life after 3 criminal convictions. A year later, after this act was passed, a nonpartisan U.S. Sentencing Commission recommended that a 100-to-1 disparity in penalties for crack cocaine and cocaine powder be abolished, along with this blatant racial bias. Clinton rejected the advice and said this: "I am not going to let anyone who peddles drugs get the idea that the cost of doing business is going down." In the 5 years following Clinton's crime bill, the country added 204 prisons and its inmate population shot up by a mind-boggling 28% to 1,305,300, and of those, nearly half, 587,300, were black, though African Americans made up only 13% of the country's population. As we can see, when we leave drug policies in the hands of fearmongers, families and neighborhoods are destroyed and torn apart. We need to have a good look on how a lot of these laws around drugs are structured and how they can be used to hurt people's lives. In an article called "The Failed Legacy of the 50-Year War on Drugs That Started with a Lie," it had this to say: "As much as both Republicans and Democrats might wish us to forget the costs of their deals, this tragic past is very much part of our present. In the 20 years since the drug war took final form under Clinton's politicians have made some relatively inconsequential reforms. In 2010, Congress made a modest cut in the sentencing disparity between the two kinds of cocaine that reduced the prison population by an estimated 1,500 inmates. Barack Obama pardoned 1,700 drug offenders, and Donald Trump signed the First Step Act that released 3,000 prisoners. Add up all those reforms, and you end up with only 1.5% of those now in prison for drug offenses. Just the tiniest drop of mercy in a vast ocean of misery." Thank you for listening, and have a nice day.